Well, hello everyone, and welcome to our panel on open source technologies. I'm David Murphy, and I will be your moderator, and I'll also be starting off with a pretty quick presentation so we can get to our other wonderful speakers. And what I'll be talking about today is the use of different free and open source applications for game development at community level. And I really want to be talking about the certain advantages, maybe we could say disadvantages of different programs, and really, just giving people an introduction to the types of tools that are very exciting that can be used for different reasons and different purposes. Okay. So my goal with this talk, if I can get this to run, is to basically share some information about these applications with you, describing their strengths and weaknesses for particular types of production. So while game development has historically been a bit of a secretive process due to fears over code being stolen, recent pushes towards open source and free software production have been changing the way that the industry works. Now today there's a plethora of free development software available for communities interested in getting into the production of games. Now, one thing to keep in mind, and this is a major issue that I think a lot of us face when we're trying to get people to make games at a community level, is that programming is not easy, and it can be something that can be challenging in order to introduce people to. So in response to these problems, quite a few applications have been developed that actually don't require any specific programming. These are great applications for new users who are interested in making games. They're wonderful for using with young audiences, children, introducing them to the logic associated with the programming process as well. I do some community-based work with Toronto's Hand-Eye Society. We do an outreach program called Game Curious, where we're teaching young kids how to play games and also make them. And when we do this, we like to use platforms that are very, very easy, especially when you're dealing with 7- and 8-year-olds. We want to get them, into the process of game making, into the fun of game making, and we want to also kind of limit the frustration. Now, luckily, there's this wonderful program called Scratch, and this was created by MIT, and it's a really, really wonderful application for introducing people to the making of games, particularly because you don't actually have to code. And I'll bring you to the website right here, and I'll show you a quick intro clip. Okay. Sorry?
Do you have a French version?
I'm not too sure if there's one yet, unfortunately, because it is done in the United States. It'd be great, though, if one could be developed, though, because it's a really, really awesome, powerful tool. One of the amazing things about Scratch, which you might notice from that clip, is that you don't actually have to type in any kind of coding. You can actually just take blocks that have prearranged code and you fit them together, and that's how you create your game. The other wonderful thing about Scratch is there's all kinds of projects online that have already been posted for Scratch. And a really great way to introduce people to Scratch is to basically open up a project that someone's already created, and then you can, kind of modify it, remix it a little bit, put in new images, move the blocks around, and that way you're also introducing people, particularly kids who we do a lot of this work with, to game making in a way where they can play around, have fun, and see immediate results from their work without, running into some of those issues where, let's say, you mess up a line and your program's repeatedly crashing. Scratch really gives you something very, very easy in order to introduce, and I shouldn't even just say a younger audience. It's great for any kind of novice audience, particularly because it's developed for introducing kids. So really anyone who's kind of worried about getting into writing code who still wants to make a game, Scratch is a great thing that you can play around with, and you can make some pretty amazing, powerful stuff. So from the work that we've done with Scratch at the community level, we found, you can start introducing it to, a pretty broad age range. Kids around 7 or 8 can pick it up and make some pretty amazing projects. You can also upload projects to the Scratch website, and you can share them with the broader community. So it's a great way of just getting people into that idea of making games. Now, Scratch can also be downloaded for free. It can be run on local computers. You don't even need an internet connection. Basically, you just need a computer that can support a relatively recent web browser. So the great thing about Scratch, too, it's easy to run. When we use it with the Hand-Eye Society, we have a bunch of PCs. They've been donated, and we just, plop a file of Scratch onto them, and we set them up in a room, and we let the kids start to play around. So, like I said, if you're trying to get people to make games within a physical space where you might have some limitations, let's say not internet access, Scratch is also a great program that you can use. Now, the interesting thing about Scratch is that it also gets into, let's see if I can bring this back up. It also gets into a more advanced program called Stencil. Now, it's a more kind of pseudo-professional type of application that's based on the type of Scratch coding. Sorry, I'm just going to try and get my PowerPoint back up. There we go. I'm not too sure how to get it to go forward now.
Just got a link here below the cat. Is that where you want to go?
No, I just want to go forward in the presentation. Yeah. Alt-Tab.
Oh, it's Mac. Sorry.
Apple Tab.
Apple-Tab.
No, I never heard of that tab. Try escape.
All right. Sorry, folks.
Where are you going?
Bring your cursor to the bottom.
Yeah, see if you go.
This is why we use open source.
What is that we're looking at? A slide?
Yeah, it's a slide. Okay. That's okay. I can just move on. That's no problem. I still have my notes, so that's fine. Okay, so Scratch also goes into a program called Stencil. The cool thing about Stencil is you can actually use it to make works that can be outputted to all kinds of different platforms. So works that can be made on things like Android, Apple, different Windows devices. Now, the thing about Stencil, though, is that there's a few different versions of it. There's a free version, and there's also paid versions, and that's where we kind of get in with some of these tools. A lot of these tools will have free versions that you can kind of download and monkey around with, but if you want to get into some more advanced usage, which is often exporting them, right, to be able to be played on a variety of formats, you get into the more paid versions of them. Another great one is Construct 2 as well. It's similar to Scratch and Stencil in the terms where there's no actual coding involved, object-oriented programming, and some people even use it for professional development as well. Okay, so those are the oriented programming applications. There's also some different applications that can be used, that there's quite some interesting and exciting scenes around them. And they're not necessarily for the types of game production that you would see with something like, Scratch, Stencil, and Construct, which I should mention is often pretty simple two-dimensional games, kind of like classic arcade games for those who are familiar. And this is Twine. And Twine's actually for telling or writing interactive and nonlinear stories. Now, Twine games, and to explain them without the use of my PowerPoint now, think about Choose Your Adventures, Choose Your Own Adventures. Anyone who's ever played those game, or books actually, book games. Twine is basically a really, really great application for writing, branching in interactive narratives. And the really interesting thing about Twine is that it's free, it's open source, it's easy to use, and there's an amazing, amazing scene that's really developed around it, particularly people writing very, very personal works, very, very political works, and sharing their work online. You can also do a really, really easy demos with Twine. It's not hard to teach people with. It's a very, very simple type of program to get people making text adventures, interactive fictions, all kinds of really interesting projects. So on the lines of Twine, there's also other programs that can be used to make more generic games. RPG Maker is another one. It's not free, actually. You have to pay for it. But if people are interested in making role-playing games, it's also quite simple. Simple object-oriented interfaces, things like dragging and dropping, so you don't really have to be programming at all. Now, well, there's a lot of great options out there for introducing people to the community production of games that aren't involving programming. There's also some really amazing free and kind of pseudo-free options for getting people involved in more advanced game production that does require coding. One really popular application is Unity, which a lot of people use for independent development. A lot of professional projects are made using Unity as well. And Unity is a lot more difficult to use. It uses, I believe, JavaScript and the C languages for coding. You generally want to have some coding experience when you're using it, but it's super powerful, and it's really amazing, the projects that you can make. I wish I could show them to you if my PowerPoint was working, but I can't. If you're really interested in getting people, and I would say fostering, game development at a community level using some of these tools, Unity's really it's the type of platform that having a community around can be pretty interesting and amazing in terms of the type of work that can be created. It's not something that's easy to necessarily introduce new users to, but if you're introducing a community starting with easier applications, hopefully you can work up to maybe building a community of Unity practitioners. And the great thing about Unity is that there's all kinds of amazing tutorials online that you can just look up and learn on your own. And there's also great scenes where developers using Unity develop communities around themselves and have different meetup groups and stuff like that in order to help people learn. So there's a lot of options out there, a lot of amazing work that can be done with them, and ideally stuff that can be also made cheaply if you have access to computers, basically, and in some cases, let's say a case of Unity, an internet connection as well. Most people who use Unity like having the internet. And I've probably talked long enough, and we should probably get on to our other speakers. So thank you very much.
Bring up my notes. I chose not to have a PowerPoint presentation. Probably a good idea. Things can be temperamental. Technology can be very temperamental. My name is Ken Zakreski. I'm the president of Gabriola Co-op Radio, CKGI, and I'm here to speak today about open source technology and the steps that we took or are taking currently, right now, in order to adapt an open source piece of software to have it tailored to our needs. So I'm going to go through the steps we went through. I'm going to talk you through the process of selecting an open source package, and then what do you got to do to make it work? How do you make it your own? Not in technical detail, but from an administrative executive's point of view. I'm the representative of the board to the project. The project we're calling Airtime A, because it's a Canadian version of an Airtime project. We're lucky enough to have the lead developer of Airtime here with Source Fabric, Albert. Albert is going to help me through forking of the software part of this, because I have trouble with that. I've only got first year computer science, so this won't be very technical. I have a BA in business, so I will add some business side language to it. This session considers open source technology and what they have to offer community media practitioners. The open source software that's available right now is robust and broad. There's a lot out there. It's very good. The days of, whoops, it crashed, are getting kind of thin. We're not seeing a lot of that anymore. So you really kind of need to become a software company of sorts when you do a project like this. You're going to provide oversight. You don't need to be technically oriented per se, but you need to know how to manage a project. You got to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And there'll be stress involved, and like there is any other project. We chose the maximum amount of time allowed, a year. And as we come up upon the last couple of weeks of that, we're finding, gee, why didn't we take 2 years? Because there's a lot of little stuff that comes up along the way. Okay, so let's get started in the steps to software nirvana. Come on in, join us. I'm just getting started on talking about open source software and developing it for your own need. So the first thing you're going to do is you're going to identify a need. We're a radio station that wanted software for scheduling. We wanted to automate our scheduling software, and we wanted it to be decentralized. So what we wanted to do was be able to have someone at home do a show, live, pre-recorded, what have you. Plus, we wanted that person to be able to also have a podcast so that somebody could download it at will. So we looked around for the perfect solution, and it's kind of weird because Open Broadcaster and Airtime were our 1 and 2 selections. I mean, that's the sort of, we narrowed it down, and then basically on the flip of a coin, Airtime came alphabetically first. We chose Airtime. Thank you. Software servicing our sector is out there. You want closer to the mic? Oh, the microphone's not near enough? Let me adjust that. How's that? Much better? I can give you a better sound there. Okay, so that's a little bit closer. First, look around for the perfect solution. And what we did was we made a list of our needs, and then we looked around for something that met those needs. We're establishing a community media service in a remote rural area with a small population. We had basically no money for software. Open source definitely falls in that category. We asked others in the field. First thing you do is ask your friends and neighbors that are your colleagues that are in that area, what do they use? And we went through a vetting process on that way. In Canada, there were several operations using airtime, and by operations, community media and commercial media and instructional media using the airtime software. We evaluated the options. We had a look at them, made a list, and kind of which one was closest to exactly what we wanted. The next thing was to sample and trial. The proof of the pudding is in the tasting. So we actually loaded these things up and gave them a spin, or went to a neighboring station that was operating it, took it for a spin, and kind of winnowed the process out a little bit as well. Now you got to remember, when you're looking at automating a process, look to software first, then hardware, because it's easy to find hardware. You just pull out your wallet. Software can get very expensive. So to find the perfect software or to find an ideal software, you want to look at software first and then look at the hardware. Now that's a lesson I learned when I was a system manager for IBM for a project at a small construction company back in the 80s now. So software first, hardware second. Be flexible, maybe. Now, when I say be flexible, maybe, I mean there's things you're going to have to do without. And maybe you can live without them, maybe you can't. So if you got to have your must-haves, wants, and desires. You got to sort those out too, because finding the perfect software will be a challenge. Consider changing your needs to adapt. So if the software doesn't provide a certain functionality, maybe you don't really need that. Like, why do you need that functionality? You got to ask yourself these questions. Okay, so now you picked the best software. What do you do then? Okay, so we went with airtime, and then, well, who's the airtime? Who are these? Source Fabric? That's not SourceForge. We're like, what? What is this? Oh, and it turns out that they have good pedigree. The software kind of came up from Campcaster. It's got good pedigree. It's been around for a while, so it's not just one or two people. It's funded. It's got sort of a foundation arm. So the next thing to consider is future development. With open source, one of the packages we looked at was sort of end of life. It was like 2 years since an update. Because we couldn't really find the developer. The developer did reply after about a month and a half, and well, I'm busy doing other projects. Bells go off. Here you've got possibly some abandonedware, and this is software that's no longer supported. Now you would think in radio or community media things don't change, but audio formats change, HTML changes, how you use things. You're going to need to maintain or adapt the software, so it's always good if you have an active developer community. So what you want to be able to do is contact those people, and they'll reply, which they didn't. So we waited for about a month and a half, and then finally somebody from Airtime did surface. We found out through their forum, they had a forum. That's another thing to look for. Do they have an active community? Decide on what changes are needed. What is it you really need in order to make everything go? And in this particular case, with the software package we were looking at, we needed to have content categories for the CRTC. In radio, the CRTC requires you to play music from various content categories under conditions of license. It used to be called promise of performance. So basically what it says is you got to play something from dance, something from hits, something from classical. We have 0% country and western because that's American culture music. Anyway, so we found out that people in Canada were using Airtime, this particular software package, for content category tracking, logging, and reporting, but they would use a comments field. So they were kind of making it work, which is what a lot of people do in community media, is they make it work. Well, we decided it would be nice to actually fix that and get that attended to. And while we were doing that patch, we were going to add some extra functionality. In community radio, we wanted to lower the infrastructure burden, the sort of administrative burden. And program directors are always constantly being concerned with how much music they're playing from various categories. Canadian content is one of those particular categories that's imperative that we have a certain amount of Canadian content. So we wanted to be able to, in real time, determine what our content was for the week, for the playing week. Another thing that radio stations do is they track, basically you track the hits, right? So you might play a song a few times and you want to be able to track that, okay? So you want that. Bands will phone you, tracking Tuesdays, did you play my song? And it gets to be burdensome for a small station like ours. So we wanted a forward-facing web page so that bands or labels, if they wanted to know if we played their song, we could just say, just go to the website, put your name in, and it'll return back the times you played, times your song was played. Another thing we wanted was reporting, so logging. Okay, so the key thing was logging. So the CRTC requires us to maintain logs of the music we played. So now we had the problem started out with the content category, so we looked at that. So that was a whole bunch of words that we could sum up with, decide on what changes you need to make. Okay, so scope and a budget. Now you're a software development company with $0. Actually, we had some money, but none for software. We had like a couple $100 budgeted, and we're like, okay. So what we did was we took this software application, it's open source, we had a developer download the code, have a look at it, and give us a size up. Now, what's involved here? It's legacy code, it looks good, it's got, they document what the various features are in there so you know what's there, so it's not going to be a big challenge to decipher it. And he's like, oh yeah, well, yeah, we should be able to do something with that. So, we're getting kind of rough order of magnitude amounts of time for how long it's going to take to manage this. So we kind of fine-tuned our budget, ask for the maximum. So we asked for the maximum, ask for as long as we can. We asked for as long as we can because these things go wrong. So we got a general feel for the changes that were needed. We got input from a developer on how hard those changes are going to be to implement. And then we went out and sought funding. So we scoped out a budget. It turns out that the particular software we were looking at wasn't written in any kind of real esoteric language. It was PHP MySQL, correct? PHP mostly with a MySQL database? Postgres?
Postgres?
Okay, so yeah, all right, this is stuff I understood from first year computer science, so they teach it in the schools, it's around, there's programmers around. This was not, PHP is not a real fancy language like, say, well, Plone would be an implementation that might be a little less, yeah. So there's, you got to look at what the open source software is written in and kind of ask around, ask your university, do you teach this type of language? Is it accessible? It was in our particular case. So now this is kind of a key point with us because we had applied for funding to amend this software the year before and were rejected. Now it turns out if you go buy a copy of Microsoft Office, that's a fixed asset purchase, okay? So when you buy software to do a job like QuickBooks or whatever, or Office, that's fixed asset purchase. Our funder, in our particular case, could not fund fixed asset funding. Now, luckily for us, our treasurer was a certified general accountant, and he says, this is a software development. This is research and development. This isn't a fixed asset purchase. So we were able to reapply and be funded because John scratched his head, figured it out, that this is something that we were going to change, and it might work for us, so it's not a fixed asset purchase. Very important for our kind of funding. Let's see here. So it's research and redevelopment. Research and development. So now you become a software company. Kinda. We needed to add some infrastructure. We hired a bookkeeper to track all the expenses of the society and report back to the project manager. So we hired a bookkeeper because we didn't have one. We just did our books like whenever the law required it. The next thing was to hire was a program manager, like a project manager. So we put out a call, try to find a project manager. We happened to find one, and that person then took over the project and did the remaining hiring. So we had the bookkeeper that reported to the board and the project manager to keep track of the money, and then the project manager to keep track of the work. So now we get into why I asked Albert to come here and talk. So this is kind of really important with the maintenance part. So you've got a project manager and you've got some open source software out there. So you're going to want to pull it down, fix it, and then put it back into the community, the open source community. And are they going to accept it as a release? Is it going to be a special, like, is there going to be parts that plug in? It's called forking. And Albert, if you could help me at this point and kind of describe to everybody some of the language that's in use and what kind of maintenance and support people can expect from the open source community when you fork a project out for a patch. Did I say that right? Okay. There's a microphone there, or use this one. Okay.
Great. Thanks, Ken. I'll just right, so my name's Albert. I'm from Source Fabric, and I'm the lead developer of Airtime, which is the project that Ken's team has forked to make their modifications to make it better suited for his community radio station here in Canada. And so the process, so Airtime is an open source project, and that means that anybody can download the source code and modify it. Anybody can tinker with it, modify it to their needs, and customize it. And so what Ken's team has done is that they've done this, they've downloaded it, they've assessed what they need, and they've created temporarily, hopefully, they've created what we call a fork. That means that they've made their own copy of it, their own version of it, which they're also publishing on the web. This is a very common thing in open source where people will take something and fork it. They'll make a new version. Sometimes they'll change the name. Like in this case, it's Airtime A. But right from the get-go, in open source, a fork is typically really the last resort or a temporary measure. Because what you want to do is you really want to send all your changes, any sort of customization or new features you add, you always want to ship those back to the original project because it saves you money in the long term. So rather than, say, a good example of, rather than like having Ken's team, so the problem with a fork, basically, is that you become responsible for maintaining the software in the long term. Whereas if you ship your changes back upstream, we call it, to the original project takes ownership over those features and ensures that they stay working. So once they're in a release, they'll, there's QA and all that stuff that goes on, and we ensure that the feature stays working. And now all of a sudden, Ken doesn't have to be a software company anymore because now Source Fabric and the Airtime team are maintaining that feature. So it's a very good way to save money in the long term, and that's definitely one of the reasons why investing your money in developing and contributing to open source is a good way to spend your money. So that shared effort that goes into these community projects ends up being a shared benefit and a shared cost savings in the long term. So hopefully, for example, with Ken's project, I've been involved since the very beginning, just at a high level, ensuring that the features that his team were going to build were things that were sensible and that we would accept as changes. And so we're going to work really hard to make sure that those features do end up in Airtime, and that anybody here in this room or elsewhere, if they want those CRTC codes and all these other features in their Airtime, that they have those in the standard version of Airtime in the future. So that's fantastic, and thank you very much, Ken.
Thanks, Albert. Yeah, I did want to add that, I forgot to mention that we were lucky in the fact that we approached the lead developer for the software package, and Albert actually sat on the hiring committee for the project manager. So we were actually able to get the lead developer to help us select a project manager because it's in our mutual interests that this thing succeed. So that was another very important thing. Thank you for mentioning that, Albert. Okay, so now you've got a project being patched or being released back. So you want to make it a release, not a patch, not a patch of a fork, but you want to make it a future release. What other things do you want to do? Well, you want to document. Now, by document, there's a couple of things there. One, you want to have your developer document the changes within the software so that they can maintain it as well. But you want your users to have documentation as well. So one very important thing we added, I think it was $1,000 for documentation of the features. So this is for the users, so when you get the package, they got the instructions, and those instructions are written by a person that knows how to write instructions, and they're clear, and you can basically, see how to use the new features. So documentation. We also put in some funding for an ebook development. So, we can ship a PDF, but PDFs are okay on this thing. But as soon as you put a kind of like a PDF on the smaller formats or stuff, text doesn't flow properly. So we're actually budgeting a little bit to have the documentation available in ebook format. Okay. So to sum up, I told you tonight is how to become a software development company by taking an open source project, working with the developer, and making that project your own, and then putting it back as a release into the open source community so that it can be maintained further by the lead developer, so that you don't have to be stuck being a software company all the time, and you can enjoy the fruits of other people's labor. I've talked a bit about the funding. The key thing there is that software development is not a fixed asset purchase. It's research and development, which is a different category. And I talked a bit about some of the other ancillary infrastructure that goes along with it, like hiring a bookkeeper to keep track of the money, working for the project manager, ebook and documentation development. And just to sum up, our feature set that we added to it was we took an existing software, we added the functionality of the content categories, and I guess nowadays it was just easier to make it an unlimited number of content categories. So if you wanted to have, let's say, FemCon or LocalCon or GermanCon, you can add these extra content categories into it just by telling it at load time how many contents categories you want. We added reporting so that you could report the hits to earshot in our case, and we added tracking so that the labels and the bands could go to a public-facing web page and look up their band and see when the songs were being played. And that was it. We're just about done. We're in beta testing now, so we'll know how everything worked out by next month. And is there any questions anybody has? Sure.
How did you integrate traffic from so good
Logging? How did we?
Sorry, could you just ask that again on the mic?
Oh, just
Yeah, we got yeah.
So on the radio side of things, like the traffic, advertising traffic, did you have a way to integrate that so you can feed that information back?
yeah.
That's just a content category. Advertising is just a content category, whether it's like a sponsorship or an advertisement. They have different content categories. So that's just built right into it. So you can track that just like you could track left-handed nuns. It's just as easy. So it was a functionality built into the existing software. Yes. Oh, we got two mics.
What was your total project budget, and who was the funder that you mentioned?
The project, we went for the maximum allowed for that round of funding was 30,000 Canadian from the Community Radio Fund of Canada. And get one if you don't have one. They are the best thing to come along since sliced bread. They funded our training manuals, and they funded this. And they're great people to work with. Lots of fun.
Okay, we should probably actually get on to our next speaker, and we can save any other questions for the end.
Thank you.
Hello, good day. I'm Jake Parsons, open broadcaster. Just to tell you why we picked it a long time ago, open source software. When the first idea came out, Rob Hopkins, when he first, I'm sure he had the idea before, but when he put it on paper and it needed to be made into the real world, it was about 12, 14 years ago, something like that. Windows crashed all the time, right? It was a resource hog. You had to run Windows 98 to have your computer work at a decent speed. Most software was proprietary. So, unless you were working on big frame in a university or a corporation, or a hobbyist, you really were stuck with crappy hardware and crappy software. And so, can you guys hear that all right? Okay. So, this was made in the Yukon. So there's some really unique rural conditions in the Yukon. It's a third the size of Alberta. It's really small compared to Ontario. And there's 40,000 people, give or take. And most live in one city, Whitehorse, about 24,000, depends on the year. Right? So, there's not a big economy. There's not a lot of money to go around. We don't have a lot of new technology, slower to get up there, electronics-wise. And so we use a lot of surplus computers. It's a government economy, so we get lots of surplus from the government. And so we don't have the brand new, it's not so easy to find funding or to afford brand new hardware. And especially at that time, we were talking Pentium 2s, Pentium 3s. Pentium 3, 600 megahertz came out in 2000, right? AMD broke the speed barrier, 1 gigahertz in 2001. So yeah, if you had half a gig of RAM, you were styling. So needed something that ran efficiently. That's another thing I forgot to mention is the electricity costs up there. They're $2 kilowatt an hour in the far Arctic. So, right, your stove is 300, 400 watts, your fridge the same. In an hour, you're paying $2 to run a house. It's not quite that bad in Whitehorse, but it's still bad enough. So you need something that ran efficiently on hardware, that didn't use up a lot of electricity. The more CPU, RAM being used, the more electricity is going to be used. You need something because, like any small rural area, there's a can-do attitude because you have no other choice, right? You can't rely on a solution from others. If something has to be done, you got to figure it out yourself. You become a jack of all trades. So we need something that fit that necessity. And open source came through that. I got into Linux refurbishing government surplus computers. And, Windows 95 from a zip disk, 125 megabytes, through a parallel port, taking 2 hours to transfer. And then unpacking that is another 2-3 hours. And then installing it's another 2 hours on a Pentium 133 486, right? Or I could stick in a USB CD or a CD on with Linux, and an hour later, I have an operating system. And that's faster. Open Star Office at that time on older computers then would take literally a minute, 30 seconds to load. Right? So we're redistributing this to people. So Rob, we met through a youth organization I used to volunteer for. I started talking about open source. You're right, because I had firsthand experience. I'm like, well, this would work great for your idea. We can use the hardware we have, right? You don't have to invest any more money. It'll run better, and it can be modified. And no one's gonna no one's going to look at you sideways for doing something quasi-illegal, like changing software. There was a huge community then, that underground community that would change windows and stuff, right? It's quasi-illegal, so it was underground. This was perfectly legal. So from a business point, you're not getting in trouble. So that one of the reasons was, financial. It comes to economics, right? It was free. There's no licensing. You can choose your licensing if you do it right, if it stays within open source, and the previous license rights are not infringed upon by the new license. You can change a license to something more suitable for your business model. There's tons of open source licenses. There's 3 versions of GPL. There's various GPLs that are slightly modified, right? And then you have the totally free BSD and the BSD and MET licenses. Mac OS 10 was based on BSD kernel, BSD license. They're allowed to modify it. They have to give the changes back. So this is a key point, actually, about open source between the GPL and the, try not to get too many legal terms in, but does it protect a company, or does it protect the work in the public, right? And when the work's in the public, it becomes community work. It becomes like video, let's say a music video put in the public domain, becomes a work of the public. Like someone covering a song is a good example, right? So the BSD gives you complete freedom to rip it off and to make money off it and modify it, and no one knows, no one cares. The other side, proprietary, right? They say we control it. You can't do anything with it. You have no rights as a user except the ones we give to you. And a lot of people just click licenses, and for like Windows 8, for example, it's not your software to use. You are given the privilege from Microsoft to use that software. So legally, it's not going to happen, but legally they could revoke your use of that software, and then where are you? Well, the GPL type, Linux type, is called copyleft, and that means that it protects the work. It protects the user by protecting the work and saying that you are allowed to change with the times. You're allowed to modify it. If someone takes it and tries to make it their own, like changing copyright, name of the guy programmed it or group, then you can't do that. That's wrong. And you're allowed to learn from it. This is huge. This is probably why, this is a personal opinion, but I believe this is one of the major reasons software, proprietary or otherwise, has improved so much in the last 10 years. Is we have a generation of university students that went through computer science, and they weren't stuck. Like, I grew up with Windows, and I remember Apple II and playing on Apple II in junior high. And, right, we never got to play with internals. We never got to make a mistake and fix it. With open source, this is what people have done. You have a whole generation. This is why they're producing just phenomenal stuff. Is they had a chance to play with it like Lego, right? They're given permission, right? Full permission. See, so it goes back to the community. It goes back to the world at large. It crosses all boundaries. So that's, I don't know, see, I kind of lost track. I have a problem with, I spent the early years when no one was listening and no one had any idea what I was talking about, trying to convince people to drop Windows and go open source. So I get on, I get passionate. And
maybe we should, because we're running a little short on time, open up back to the audience if they have any questions they want to ask about open source technologies. I know it's a lot to take in, but just thinking about them, I mean, the main thing that comes off the top of my head is when we're thinking about community production, right? It's not just the community production of content, I guess, in some cases with open source, but it's also our infrastructure in terms of how we operate. And I mean, that's what gets me excited when I start thinking about open source technologies. And I'm curious, I mean, if anyone else would like to, questions or comments?
C'est pas vraiment moi, mais je reçois des courriels du Québec. I receive a lot of email from Quebec TV, and they ask if those open source can be available for TV. Can we use it for archives for TV? Can we use it for programmation? Because with all the technology we have now, it costs at least $50,000 to buy it, and after you have to pay somebody to came back again and again. So I don't know,
Yeah,
can
that
it be
goes back-
useful for a TV?
Yeah, of course. You can, you know, if you use it honestly, you can use it however you want, as long as you're not trying to change, say that you wrote it and the people that didn't. You can use it's up to your imagination and building it, right? So.
I wanted to, this question was asked to me, that exact question was asked to me about airtime, because somebody said, well, I want for TV what you have for radio, and that's an automated scheduler system. Can airtime do video?
No.
Not even close, eh? Yeah, not even close.
Totally different.
Book and what CRTC asked for us.
Open
Yeah.
Broadcaster can do video.
There we go.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah. Open Broadcaster can do video. Oh, sorry.
Okay.
Open Broadcaster can do video. We actually, you could set it in between your standard cable box that splits the streams to the different areas. Yeah.
Okay. Just gonna look if I have other question from Quebec.
Absolutely. Any questions in the crowd before, while we're waiting? Yeah, over here. Great. On my way.
Hey, so my name's Aaron Bell. I'm a student of the Open University in the UK, and I'm a core developer of the Free Radius project, which is an open source project that deals with, it's mainly in authentication for large ISPs and for Eduroam, which hopefully some people use here. It's an international academic wireless network. So if you are from a university in Japan and you come to Carleton University here, you can get on the wireless network using your University of Japan, whatever university you are there, credentials. Anyway, so my question is actually for Ken. So most of these open source projects have got a commercial arm attached to them, usually a consultancy firm of some kind. So why did you build up all the infrastructure internally to manage this project and not sort of outsource it to the people who are actually involved in development on the day-to-day?
Well, that's a good question. To be honest with you, we never thought of it. We never actually thought of outsourcing the infrastructure for it. Oh, actually, no. Yeah. Well, we had a discussion with our funder, and they're wanting to build up the resources in the sector. So I don't know if it was formal or informal, but they did indicate, no, we don't want you just to contract the whole thing out to a company. We would, and I can't remember the exact wording, but I believe it was, we would prefer you to hire and maintain local developers and contractors or employees. Basically, they're like an employee to do it. And then the reasoning explained to me was that they want to develop this sort of infrastructure in the community radio community of people. So that was, to answer your question, that is why we ended up not outsourcing the infrastructure for the development of the software. Was to develop the community within the community radio services so that now we have some expertise that we can access.
Other question? Great.
It's not a question so much as a comment, but I'm from the library sector, and I worked at libraries that have used open source software for things like their catalog and things like that. And I can tell you that the expertise that we built up in-house from people kind of working on the software and working on customizing the software and troubleshooting when things went wrong, even though it was infrequent, built up so much knowledge in-house about this. And these are all skills that people are able to apply to other projects in the future. And so even though it was scary, I think, to jump into that at the beginning, not having to rely on all of these vendors and instead kind of getting to work together and to build up that expertise was such a good thing for our smaller communities when I was in there. So just yay, open source.
I'm just going to address that point.
Yay.
When we were looking for software to do playback for audio, one of the things that came up was our local library had audiobooks. And they had developed the ability to play audio in a language called Plone, which at the time was rocket science, or NASA was using it, so we kind of got scared of it. But the library software for playback of audio was very impressive. It tracked a lot of things that we wanted it to track. And the libraries were doing a great job. And really, if you have a librarian in your community, they would certainly be a resource on dealing with open source software, because if they're using the one that we had at Nanaimo Library, at the Vancouver Island Regional Library, it's an excellent, excellent application. It's rock solid, never had a problem with it. Yay, libraries.
Any more questions from the floor about anything at all? I mean, I should say, just to provide a final comment, or if anyone even wants to pipe in before we go on the panel. I mean, what really interests me about, I guess, some of the questions that have been raised, and I keep thinking about this, and we think about this idea of why the local's important, right? And I keep thinking about how open source can be developed in ways to meet local community needs, which can be different, right? Whereas you can't necessarily rely on, those big software companies who are really trying to look to appeal to a very, very broad base of users to maybe, have applications that are going to, run up in northern Canada, or applications that are going to meet, the needs of a small island, and how we can think about open source, really in this kind of amazing way of communities really taking it on themselves in order to create the tools and share the tools, right, for their community media. And to me, I mean, that's just so, I mean, it's just another level of community media production that's not necessarily stuff that, we might not see on the screen, but is definitely something that's going on in very exciting ways. So does anyone else want to add anything or say anything? Oh, yeah, Heather.
So what we're seeing now is, of course, the move towards everything going to the cloud, and of course, all the proprietary software involved. So for the open source community, let's say someone comes up with an open broadcaster where they give it out for free and maintain it for free, right? And then basically try to get all the local communities to start adopting it. Do you see that happening? Someone starting to do the cloud equivalent of open broadcaster, but can still be open, about it?
Well, GitHub, right? That's you're essentially talking about GitHub, where
not quite though, because the GitHub code is the proprietary part. What I mean is, you would actually offer like open broadcaster, and you would host it all for free.
And then, yeah. Or for free. Well,
that's so you know what I
someone
mean?
has to pay the hosting bills, right?
But that's
so what the open source model is, the traditional, like Red Hat became the first billion-dollar open source company doing this, is you provide the service. So what you're doing is you provide, right? You give the product for free.
Sorry, but what I'm saying is that model, though, do you see that lasting? Because no one's going to want to have that software.
I see it expanding, actually.
But I don't want that software in my IT department anymore. I don't want to maintain that. I'm going to want someone else to that's what everybody's doing. Get it out to the cloud, get some other people to maintain it. I don't want Red Hat locally. I want it on one box, VM'd, and everyone have dumb terminals. That's where we're going.
Yeah, I see.
Do you do that with Airtime?
Yeah. Can I jump in?
Yeah,
sure.
So we do this with Airtime as well, and it's actually it's very good for open source. We have a hosted cloud version of Airtime where we do we do exactly that. We take the infrastructure off your shoulders,
While still keeping the code open source.
So we have an open source version as well, and this pro version that you can just pay us monthly for. And those are separate products that work for different people. And it's good for open source because it's a very easy way to make your open source project sustainable. So that's ultimately why, and right now we're still trying to work out the balance between the two, keeping the code open source, but still being able to make money. But so far it's working. And
That's amazing.
This is very common with web-based software now. Like WordPress is another good example. There's WordPress.com, but you can also download it yourself, WordPress.org.
Okay. Yeah. No, good to hear. Good to hear.
Any other questions? All right.
So yeah, this is the way. So open source maybe 10 years ago was sort of a hobbyist thing. Everyone would get around and they would share patches on things called mailing lists and Usenet. Now it's moving into sort of a more professional thing where people can actually make their living off of it. And a great way of doing that is offering these cloud services, because you can keep the software free for everyone to use, but you also have a consistent revenue stream coming off it. And open source projects aren't free. They take a lot of time. And if you're spending time coding on open source projects, you're not spending time coding for food and heating and shelter. So that was sort of why I posed the question originally to Ken, is because if you do outsource the development to sort of other contractors, you're not putting funds back into the project, and that's kind of important. They need to be funded to be sustainable. So this is a great way of moving away from having a core development team and democratizing the development of the project is by having a hosted solution. So question and point. So.
Does anyone else want to add or respond or pipe in? I think it's a really interesting comment, and I think a really important one as well. I mean, I even think, I can even blame myself for having that tendency sometimes. There's that, when you look at open source, to think free, everything's free. And it's like, well, there's people putting a lot of labor into this, and I mean, it's really important to recognize that, right? Definitely. And I mean, we also live in a, I like free things, but people also, at least from a community media perspective, need to eat, right? And I mean, we have to keep these in mind as well when we're thinking about open source. That's also where you get into, a lot of different projects like forking we were talking about before and things along those lines. And I'm talking way too much. So does anyone else want to add any? I guess we should probably be wrapping up soon. Any final points, any final questions, any final comments? Or for the rest of the panel, anything final you'd like to say?
No. I'm good.
Good. We all good, everyone? All right. Well, thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it, and enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you.